All right. So, coming off of the past 2 days, Tes Yud Kislev, which are, of course, very much connected, in particular with the Mitteler Rebbe of Chabad, and the connection being that the Mitteler Rebbe was born and was nifter, nostalgic on Tes Kislev. He was born in the year Tafkuf Lamed Daled, passed away in the year Tafkuf Peches, at the age of the mere age of 54. He had been the Rebbe since Tafkuf Ayin Gimel when his father passed away, so about 15 years. So that's Tes, and that's already mentioned in Beis Rebbe in the appropriate portions of the Sefer dealing with the Mitteler Rebbe. So that's Tes, and the date of Yud, of course, is connected to his whole legal situation in his final years. As we know, today it stretched over the course of 2 years, from Tafkuf Pei Vav to Tafkuf Pei Ches. And there was some kind of geula, there was some kind of positive development that took place during one of these years on Yud Kislev. And that's marked as the geula of the Mitteler Rebbe. So it's, in addition to Yud Tes Kislev, the Chag Geula of the Alter Rebbe, there's Yud Kislev for the Mitteler Rebbe. So, that being the case, I wanted to discuss some of the lesser known aspects relating to these dates. Now, with regard to this parsha at the end of the Mitteler Rebbe's life, the arrest, and like I said, it was a whole legal situation, and the fact that it took place at the end of his life, in other words, he passed away at what we can consider to be a premature age, might have been, for all we know, connected to what he was experiencing, to what he was dealing with, because even though there had been this geula, but as we now know, the case hadn't been fully closed. It was still ongoing. There was a short tkufa where he was actually in detention and under police supervision, government supervision, and then he was released, and that's probably what the geula is in reference to. But it was still an ongoing case that really tied up his attention, his resources during those 2 years, and so may very well have contributed to his premature passing. So when it comes to this parsha at the end of the Mitteler Rebbe's life, it would seem to be the case that it's not very popular, it's not very common that people are looking too deeply into that whole story to get to the bottom of what exactly happened there. Now, generally speaking, there are 2 general routes you could go, sources you could look into. One track is the more Chassidus sources, Chassidus Mekayres. You have the Sichos, the writings of the Frierdiker Rebbe, who touched on it, who wrote about this tkufa in the Mitteler Rebbe's life. Before the Frierdiker Rebbe, you also had the Beis Rebbe. There may be other Chassidus Maises from other sources as well. That's one track. And then you have the other track is the more academic approach, the documents that Rebbe Levin published in the Nuns in the 90s from the original case files in Russia. For those who don't know or who need a refresher, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, it turned out that the Russians were actually far more organized bureaucrats than the impression you may have gotten from the stories that you hear as children. The batlonus, perhaps, of the authorities might be slightly exaggerated, but unlike Poland at the time, Russia was actually pretty organized and had a strong bureaucracy. And when the Alter Rebbe was arrested and the Mitteler Rebbe was arrested, they built entire files around these arrests, and these files were preserved in their appropriate place. And through the Tsars, through the Communist Revolution, through World War II, the Holocaust, these documents were preserved. And then finally, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, with Chabad achieving a much more comfortable position in Russia, Chabad received access to these files, and that's when a lot of very important, fascinating original material from the Rebbeim's arrests was discovered, including new writings from the Rebbeim themselves, stuff from the Alter Rebbe, from the Mitteler Rebbe, that was only preserved in these files, and that's a whole story in its own right. We could elaborate on that alone, but at any rate, once these what had previously been just general stories, a general sense of the story of Alter Rebbe's arrest, Mitteler Rebbe's arrest, became a lot more concrete with dates and details and the exact legal process they were dealing with, many details that had not been known before. If I could make a general comment, I would I would observe that it seems that this new material from these arrests of the Alter Rebbe, Mitteler Rebbe, doesn't feel like it ever fully caught on, fully settled in, was fully accepted in Chabad as primary source material, meaning there still seems to be a certain gap between the writings of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the formal writings that were issued that are given a certain kedusha, versus the material that originated, that appeared from research, from academic sources, from that type of that arrived through that route, even if there are things that are literally Ksaviat Kodesh of Alter Rebbe, things Alter Rebbe himself wrote, and how many Kisvei Yad of Alter Rebbe do we have? Whatever the number is, it's not that high. And here you have Kisvei Yad of Alter Rebbe, Mamash Barichas, so l'chayr that should have the same kedusha. But that's just the reality, that it hasn't fully found its place. Also, much of it only came to the surface, Mamash Tafshin and Beis and onwards. So we didn't really have a chance to see how and if the Rebbe would have embraced it or quoted it, cited it. If look at the Sichos, we mitzayint it, that would probably give it a boost. But we didn't have a chance to see what the Rebbe's response would have been to it directly. And I've already taken the opportunity. Previous years, Yutas Kislev, I've spoken, I've had the opportunity to speak, and I've used some of this material that we have from Alter Rebbe as a basis for a more original, interesting discussion surrounding Yutas Kislev. But that's the Alter Rebbe, and it would seem that the information about the Mitteler Rebbe has remained even more obscure and mostly forgotten. And I could just offer some conjecture. I would say, perhaps it's Rebbe 11 issued this contrast, the Meiser Gul of the Admo Hamtzai in the late Nuns. So Rebbe 11, with all his milas, usually has a relatively dry, facts-only manner of writing. So perhaps that didn't serve to draw many people in. It only really just appears in this small contrast, which you can go for decades and not run into it anywhere. Although I will point out that you can find the text of this contrast now on chabadlibrary.org/books, where you have the text of a number of Chabad Sfarim. The text of this contrast is there. You can also find a PDF online, etc. So, whoever is interested in the history and the details, I would certainly recommend that you look there, and you look in Rebbe 11's other sefer that he put out a few years ago, Tolas Chabad Borussia Hatzaris, chapter 44 onward, and there you have a larger arc of history from the beginning of Chassidus through the entire period that was Tsarist Russia, and I'll point out, I'll remind that, it might be written a bit dry, that might be the case, but if you come at it with approach it with the right attitude, there's a lot of precious, fascinating stuff that you can extract from there, and like we're going to try to do here in just a bit. So, but in addition to the two, I presented it as two. Either there's the stuff of the Rebbeim, like the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe, versus the documents. But really, there's also, you could say, a third approach, which is to, if we're going to talk about the Mitteler Rebbe and his arrest and that whole parsha, we could look and restrict ourselves just to looking at what the Mitteler Rebbe himself wrote. What do we have, whatever material that we have from the Mitteler Rebbe, from this tkufa, from this period. And there are letters of the Mitteler Rebbe that were preserved from this period, not through the channel of the case file. I'm not sure if any original Hebrew material was preserved in the Mitteler Rebbe's case file. I think it's all translated. So there's certain letters in the Mitteler Rebbe that we don't have from elsewhere, but we don't actually have the Hebrew text. We only have the Russian translation that was prepared in the process of investigating the Mitteler Rebbe. But there are letters in Lashon HaKodesh from the Mitteler Rebbe about his whole situation that were preserved through the regular channels, the regular manuscripts of Chassidim. People would copy letters of the Rebbeim if they happen to come across them. And in Tafshin Ayin Gimel, not that long ago, Rebbe 11 reprinted the Igros of the Mitteler Rebbe, and as it stands now, there are 81 Igros, 81 letters of the Mitteler Rebbe, plus 34 additional documents, Nispachim, that are related to the life and times of the Mitteler Rebbe. And if you just simply open it up, you can see the Mitteler Rebbe's words directly. And Lamaisa, it seems like it's not very common to look there either. So my goal, the plan here is to take a look at what the Mitteler Rebbe himself was writing in this last tkufa, specifically in his Igros. If we were to look at the Mitteler Rebbe during this time, there's also his Titus, his Mamorim, his Drushim. Lately, we have a whole sefer, Mafteach, Sifrei, Udrushay Admo Ha'emtzai, came out a few years ago, which makes it very easy to see what the Mitteler Rebbe was talking about in those last years as well. But we're going to focus here specifically on the Igros, which, like I said, haven't really been looked at by many. I'll start in brief with the very last letter, which I would say is mildly interesting. The very last letter of the Mitteler Rebbe was actually written a mere 2 days before his Estalkus, as we know, in Yezhin. So this is the last letter there. It's not the last letter of the 81, because the way the Rebbe 11 sets up the Igros is that he sorts all the ones that have a date or an estimated date in order, and then those are followed by those that are chasrei tarich. So it's not the final letter in the Sefer, but it's 60 something. We'll see later. I didn't note the number of this one, but we'll note the numbers of the other ones before it. So it's somewhere in the mid or late 60s in the numbering of the Igros there. So this letter is dated Yom Beis Zayin Kislev Tafkuf Peches Yezhin, and it's addressed Lachasni. It's addressed to my son-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek. And as we'll see, this was specifically with regards to what was going on in the Tzemach Tzedek's family at that time. Chalal would be interesting to find the opportunity to speak at length about the interesting connection and dynamic between Mitteler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. In very general terms, we know that Tzemach Tzedek did not really consider himself, did not act as a chassid of the Mitteler Rebbe, but essentially was a co-mekabel directly from the Alter Rebbe. And in his writings, he seems to essentially ignore his father-in-law's Torah. And even when it came to the Hanachas, those that had written down the Alter Rebbe's Torah, it seems like he tried his utmost to use the writings of others. But if you search, you will find that occasionally he does refer to the Hanachas. He'll write Doidi V'chomi, Dal Vav Ches, or something like that. That's the title that he'll Doidi V'chomi Harav. So there are some instances where you see him refer to his uncle and father-in-law in that manner. So that's a whole interesting topic in its own right. Lamaisa, we find that the Mitteler Rebbe addressed a number of letters to him. If you look through the letters, you'll see that there's a certain degree of correspondence, especially if the Mitteler Rebbe was out of town, which is a whole different parsha, whole different discussion for another time. Interesting letters the Mitteler Rebbe wrote. And Bichlal, there are different documents from Beis Harav at that time that shed light on the interesting dynamics that there were in the family. Mitteler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, you have to remember that Alter Rebbe's brother, the Maharil, was in a certain sense his right-hand man. B'chayav, the Maharil, was also still around, and he also cast his shadow on the Beis Harav, on the family. And like I said, it's a pretty, it's not a very, people aren't, it's not popular to talk about and investigate the whole dynamic at the time, but it's, for those that find it interesting, it's interesting. So the letter is addressed L'chasni, and Mitteler Rebbe begins by addressing his health. At that time, his health was very poor. Going into the day of his Estalkus, Mitteler Rebbe writes, "In l'chadish oidis b'riusi, nothing new about my health. May Hashem heal me soon, refuah shlema, and we should have toivus, yeshuas, and achamas, the klal ubeprat." And Bar 11 in the footnote cites from Beis Rebbe that he had already been there in Yezhin for a few weeks in this state. He wasn't doing very well health-wise. So what's the letter about? So Mitteler Rebbe says, "Ahuvi chasni, my beloved, my son-in-law, what I'm thinking right now, and I decided, I'm going to let you know, and you'll have to decide on your own to accept what I'm saying, but what I'm suggesting strongly is that your son, B'noi Raz, B'noi Reb Zalman," so we know that Tzemach Tzedek had a son, Reb Chaim Shneur Zalman. He was, I believe, his third son, if I'm not mistaken, after the Baruch Shalom and Maharil, Migdal Rebbe. Since his name is Reb Shneur Zalman, that is a good clue that he was born right after the Alter Rebbe passed away. He was born in Tavkaf Daled, and now he was around 14. He was getting married this year, Tavkaf Peches, which was typically the age of marriage in Beis Harav for many generations. So with regard to the chassan of your son, Raz, Bas Giloy, the Mazel Tov, it should be B'tzina and B'kerev Hayam. It should be done low-key, and it should be done very soon, no later than Zayin Tevis. So this is being written as Zayin Kislev, so 1 month. Mitteler Rebbe is giving 1 month. Maybe that's why he chose that date. No later than a month from now, in Homel. Why Homel? Because that's where the Mechutin, the Mechutin wasn't from Beis Harav. The Mechutin was Shaya Halevi of Homel, and so that was where the Kala was. That's where the Chasana was going to be held. So it should be held in Homel without spending much money. Just 2 wagons of people should go, and there should be clothing. Whatever the usual expenses were should be kept to a minimum kafi hechrech gadol, only the absolute minimum, whatever is an absolute must. Mitteler Rebbe adds, as many other well-to-do people have done in the thousands, which is interesting. And Mitteler Rebbe says, Hashem yemel toiv l'mazel toiv be'eis tzaras Yisrael. It should be a good event, a mazel tov, but at a time which is tzaras Yisrael. Yarchav Hashem l'Yisrael v'yamali kol chesroinam. So Mitteler Rebbe is asking that it should be done very low-key, not maybe what you would think you would consider to be a Rebbe shechasana. It would seem pretty obvious as well that Mitteler Rebbe at this point, before passing away, was not planning on participating and traveling there himself. And this makes sense in light of the fact, like we said, Mitteler Rebbe was still under investigation, so that could be the obvious reason. Part of the accusations, as we'll see, related to the monetary affairs of Beis Harav, the fundraising for the expenses of Beis Harav. So that alone would probably be enough to explain why it might not be a good time for Beis Harav to suddenly be splurging on a wedding using perhaps the Chassidim's money. However, it's also interesting that Mitteler Rebbe also seems to be referring to some kind of general tzara, of the klal, of everyone, and that might suggest, not 100% clear, but it might suggest that perhaps around this time there was a more general matzav of difficulty in parnasa for everybody, and maybe that would also make it even worse. If they were to do a big chasen at the time, it would perhaps stand out even more if that's the case. I recall that in Alter Rebbe's letters, maybe even it's partially in Ageres HaKodesh, there's the Alter Rebbe has a letter, at least one, with regards to a certain year, B'chai the Alter Rebbe, where also there was a big financial dip and people had it very difficult. And the Alter Rebbe was reacting to that and responding to that and demanding that the tzedakah should be given in the same manner, etc. So the idea of there being a bad year finance-wise was certainly something that's very plausible in the Mitteler Rebbe's day as well, and just like today in our era as well. There are years that generally there's a sense of a year where there's harchava and a year where it might be less so. So that seems to be part of the background here behind the Mitteler Rebbe's request. And this generally ties into the more general topic of shidduchim and marriage and Beis Harav, which we touched on recently when we spoke about the Tanoim with Alter Rebbe and Tafkuf Samach Tes. And before I started this series, I also, a few weeks before that, was digging into various aspects of the shidduchim and Beis Harav. So this ties into that as well. Here you have the Mitteler Rebbe telling Tzemach Tzedek what he thinks about what's appropriate at this particular time. I'll also point out that the Mitteler Rebbe refers to his Einikol, who was 14 at the time, by the initials Raz, Reb Zalman. So with regard to that, I'll point out that maybe there's a parallel here. We know that Tzemach Tzedek is said to have already called his Einiklach, the Rebbe Rashab, and his older brother, the Razah, by these acronyms, Razah, Rashab, already when they were very young, 4 or 5, or maybe younger. The Tzemach Tzedek had this minig of giving his Einiklach these chashuv initials. So perhaps that's an interesting parallel to draw, where the Mitteler Rebbe is also giving his Einikol, Reb Zalman, Chaim Shnei Zalman, later of Liadi, a similar title. So that's what he writes to the Tzemach Tzedek, and he says, I have the same opinion about another shidduch that was taking place in the family at the time. The Mitteler Rebbe's other Edom, Rabbi Kasil Zalman, who was an Einikol related to Barditchev, he's also doing a shidduch. I have the same opinion about that. He signs, these are the words of your father-in-law. And then he added another line. He said, and I think I'm under the impression that you'll heed my advice. This is something that we need to take seriously. We need to be concerned about based on what's happening. I don't need to elaborate for someone as intelligent and wise as you. Again, he seems to be alluding to the fact that it's simply logical, based on the circumstances, to have a low-key chasana. It's interesting that Chalal, this Lashon, if you read between the lines or between the words, I'm under the impression, I think you're going to listen, which implies that he doesn't know for sure that the Tzemach Tzedek will listen to him. The Tzemach Tzedek, Derech Klal, has a certain independence, but particularly in this scenario, you'll understand why I'm right, so you'll agree. So interesting to note, like I said, the dynamic between Mitteler Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek here. Then he added a line there to his brother as well. I believe it's to Reb Chaim Avram. It's a cryptic line, and you can look it up if you want to see what exactly it says. There's some reference there to the Seder Halimud, although it's really not clear what he's referring to. Maybe we can try to decipher what it means on another occasion. But with regard to Seder Halimud, we do have writings from the Mitteler Rebbe with regard to the Seder Halimud. You can see in Igros Mitteler Rebbe, today it's number 41, Igros 41, where the Mitteler Rebbe wrote the Seder Halimud for people at different stages of life, and that would be its own worthy topic to discuss. The concept of Musar, the Seder Halimud from Rabbi Seinu Nesienu, from the earlier Dairis till our generation, that's a fascinating topic in its own right, and there is documented writings, like I said, for example here, the Mitteler Rebbe. So perhaps Mitteler Rebbe is alluding to something relating to that, but it's unclear. So that's the letter. That's the final letter we have from the Mitteler Rebbe. Not very well known. I don't remember anyone ever talking about it. Obviously, like I said, it's technically only a mildly interesting letter, but it's still interesting to see that there's a letter from 2 days before Mitteler Rebbe passed away, and this is what the Mitteler Rebbe is writing. And so we see that in his last days, his last hours, in addition to his concern about his health, which obviously was very poor at the time, this was what was occupying Mitteler Rebbe and concerning him, and this is what he was dealing with. We could also, if you want, we could try to interpret it as perhaps indirectly predicting his imminent passing. Although, technically speaking, after the Mitteler Rebbe passed away, it probably made it harder to keep to the date of doing the chasana no later than a month. Zayin Tevis probably made it less likely that that date would work. And Lamais, if you look in the Sefer B'nai Tzemach Tzedek, where Amram Bloy, in his Perek on Liadi, on the Hoif of Liadi, page 126, footnote 7, we can actually, I mentioned previously that often the Mamorim of the Rebbeim would have information regarding the time and place that appeared as a line before the Maimer would start. So we actually do find, and often there's information there that can't be attested to from anywhere else. It can help us trace and place where the Rebbeim were, especially if they were traveling. So we actually find there, he points out there's a Maimer in the Tzemach Tzedek from Tafkuf Peches, from Shabbos Zocher, and the title in the Ksav Yad is Hamle al HaChasana. He doesn't write the date, but if you look it up, Shabbos Zocher that year was Ches Adar. So it got delayed, Zayin Kislev, Zayin Tevis, Shvat, Ches Adar. That's when the wedding took place in actuality. So that's the last letter. With regard to Mitteler Rebbe's passing, that you can read about and find in other Makaitis. I'm not going to get into that. But really, if you look at the letters beforehand, before that last letter, there in Igris, there are some other letters to Mitteler Rebbe from this tkufa after the whole arrest happened, after this whole situation began. And these letters, in these letters, the Mitteler Rebbe is corresponding with his loyal Chassidim with regard to strategizing, planning what needs to be done, how to respond to the government, how to engage with the government. And when I took a look at them this week, and I'll admit I'm a little embarrassed, but I somehow never really got to look at them. Maybe if you read them quickly, they don't necessarily seem too interesting, or it's hard to understand what they're saying. But if you actually take a look, there's actually a very interesting theme going on with those letters, where the Mitteler Rebbe was actually giving a lot of thought to the question of what is the nature, what is the definition of the Hasidic movement, and how does it fit in to the rest of Yiddishkeit at the time, to the history of Yiddishkeit. And Mitteler Rebbe was thinking about approaching it in a very interesting way, and that's what I want to focus on here. Just to back up a tiny bit, what the Mitteler Rebbe was reacting to. Mitteler Rebbe was reacting to a malshinos. Someone had been malshin the Mitteler Rebbe to the authorities, to the local authorities. We know that it actually came from a relative, a family relative of the Beis Harav in Vitebsk. B'Pashtos, this person was a relative via the Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin. We know the Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin came from a chashuv, powerful family in Vitebsk. We know there's actually stories about how when the Alter Rebbe was first married and was starting out on his new path, he didn't actually get along very well with his family, and he got away from there as soon as he was able to, and branched out and built his own inyan. So it's not even clear what the dynamic exactly was there between the Alter Rebbe and his Rebbetzins family. In the writings in the Mitteler Rebbe's file, there actually is a letter that's said to be from the Mitteler Rebbe to this fellow who later became the Malshin from a few years earlier. The Mitteler Rebbe seems to be writing warmly to him, but it's hard to, I haven't seen anyone fully explain or attempt to understand what exactly the whole connection and dynamic there was before and after. I haven't even seen anybody explain how exactly this fellow was related, but he clearly was. So this fellow in Vitebsk had submitted this malshinos to the authorities in Vitebsk, which was also the seat of the government in the region, and Lubavitch was part of the region. So in this malshinos, Sai with regard to the malshin's motives, and Sai with regard to the actual substance of the malshinos, there's a combination of financial, monetary matters, the money that the Mitteler Rebbe is fundraising, and more general hatred towards Chassidus. About a year or so ago, I came across an interesting article or chapter in Russian one of the tricks, one of the hacks I use sometimes when looking things up and researching is if it's neged to something that took place in Russia, even if you don't know Russian, you don't know the Russian alphabet, but with the aid of Google Translate, you can get the key search terms in Russian and then search those, and then use Google Translate to see what the results are. You can often find information that isn't readily available in English. So there's an article, you can find it on Academia. The article, the chapter is called "The Secret of the Schneerson Family: Documents of the National Historical Archives of Belarus on the Founding of the Dynasty of Lubavitch Tzaddikim." And it's from a larger book of apparently of research relating to documents from Vitebsk. It seems like just this chapter, it's just 4 pages, but a lot of text. But these 4 pages that seem to deal with the Schneerson family, Beis Harav, versus the rest of the book. And it's written by 3 researchers, Belyavsky and et al., the others as well. And as far as I know, these are the only researchers that I'm aware of, in addition to Bar Levin, who've actually studied these documents of the arrest that were preserved in Vitebsk. The documents were all related. This whole parsha took place in Vitebsk. So they, due to their interest in the history of Belarus, so they've also researched these documents, and then they write about it more freely, perhaps, than Rebbe Levin will write about it. And going through that article, I learned the number of Chadushim, or a number of points were clarified. With regard to the actual Malshin and the Malshinos, the way what they write using Google Translate is that the author wasn't just a poor relative, a blackmailer. He was a representative of the richest Jewish family in Vitebsk, a respected citizen, even awarded a medal for helping the Russian army during the War of 1812. So, Chashve guy, their interpretation is, one can assume, an attempt to use the authorities to resolve some internal struggle between influential Jewish families. So they understand that it was less about just pure blackmail, which is often how it's portrayed in Chabad, where he wanted a cut of the money or whatever, and then got resentful. They're leaning more towards that it's a power struggle between influential Jewish families. Of course, it's not absolute proof that money wasn't a factor, but I don't see a problem with saying that the power and the money were intertwined, and it's hard to know what's the sibba and what's the mesubov. And like we said, a notable part of the Malshinos does deal with the more sociological aspect of the role that Chassidim were having on society, on the Jewish society. If you look at the Malshinos, which was reproduced in Rebbe Levin's Kuntras, and I believe there's also a Russian website, alter-rebbe.something.org perhaps, but I'm not 100% sure. You got to double check. But there is a website where they actually have uploaded scans of all the original documents from the rest of the Alter Rebbe Mitteler Rebbe, and which are all in Russian, and they've put up the text as well, the text of those pages in text form. So if you want to actually attempt to look at the documents directly, you can do that there. So if you look at the Malshinos, you'll see that there was the financial aspect. The Mitteler was raising money, and what's all the money for? And that was relating to the money that was raised for the Maimed, that was raised to support the family, particularly after the Alter Rebbe passed away and after the destruction of Napoleon's invasion. At that point, the Alter Rebbe had a pretty big family, and it seems like their main source of parnasa, achnasa, was this fundraising. So Mitteler Rebbe was overseeing this large fundraising project, Pasha, to support the entire extended family, and that became the basis of the Malshinos. So that's certainly a part of it, but there's also a strong component of describing how Chassidim are causing strife in various ways in the local Jewish communities. This is, of course, later periods, not the Alter Rebbe's period. The Alter Rebbe's period, Chassidus was still new, was still causing shockwaves. At this point, Chassidus was pretty well established. We don't find any much other indications of ongoing venomous snagdos like we find in the time of the Alter Rebbe. The last time the Alter Rebbe had been arrested at this point had been like 25 years earlier. Seems like most had moved on, but even if it wasn't this large battle for the soul of Judaism, but there were always, if you read the books on the history, the ones that dig into the police files, the local police files, in every kehillah, there always were local disputes, local machlekasin, and especially based on the very important cloud that Amal, every city had one kahal, one unified entity that was a kehillah, so there was always a lot to fight over. So while originally at the height of the Snagdos, let's say the Misnagdim, it seems at times were fighting against the right for the Chassidim to have a minyan at all, meaning even if Chassidim were going to hold their minyan in a totally different location or at home, it seems like the Misnagdim were objecting to that. We see that in the documents, the Haramis, the Pashkevilin that we have from that era as well. They were very offended by the existence of these breakaway minyanim. So let's say at the height of the Alter Rebbe, with the fight of the Alter Rebbe, they were fighting against the minyanim at all, but maybe at this point that wasn't the fight, but maybe Adrab, now the Chassidim were emboldened, and you could find where there might be a shtetl where the Chassidim are fighting over control over the shul. The Chassidim want to make the shul a Chassidish shul. Every city had its main shul at the time. That's the way it's described in Shulchan Aruch, that every place is supposed to have its official Beis HaKnesses, and then you can have additional minyanim. So you could have strife in that sense, a more localized dispute, and that seems to be the style in which this Malshinus is written, more about these types of fights. So it would seem that even if this wasn't really pitched as this cosmic attack on Chassidus per se, and you could see the difference. The Alter Rebbe was hauled off to Peterburg both times, and the Tsar was directly involved. It was in the case of the Alter Rebbe, it was treated far more seriously, far more harshly, whereas here it was treated more like a local issue, a local complaint, a local issue, where the governor, or whatever the precise term would be, of Vitebsk was the one running the case. So you could say Chassidus wasn't directly threatening the Tsar. In the first Malshinus, it's directly threatening the entire rule of the Tsar. Here, that's not exactly how it was presented, but it was just presented as it's threatening the Seder to have a proper order, law and order in the local community. It's more of a local issue. So that's a distinction you could say there is between the two. But ultimately, it was still getting at the heart of what Chassidus is, as we shall see in the Mitteler Rebbe's response and reaction as well. And then that's Bekitzer, if you could call that Bekitzer. That's Bekitzer, what we need to know for now, going into it. So if you look in the Igros the Mitteler Rebbe, and here I have the numbers. If you look in Igeres Samach Vav 66, so the last one that we were talking about was Samach Samach Ches, somewhere around there. So in Igeres Samach Vav, which Rebbe doesn't have a date, but Rebbe 11 dates it to the beginning of Tevis Tafkuf Pevav. So shortly after the Mitteler Rebbe was arrested and released, which, according to Rebbe 11's understanding, that's the date of Yud Kislev. Yud Kislev Tafkuf Pevav was when Mitteler Rebbe was released shortly after being detained. That was the Geula, but that was just the beginning of his legal issues. And if you look at the previous letter there as well, the Igeres Samachei, there's also a similar letter in a similar style, but it's not directly relevant to what we're talking about here. So if you look at Igeres Samach Vav, from around this time, we find that the Mitteler Rebbe is writing to Yedidi Reb Leib Baharav Shichya, and they suggest, Rebbe 11 suggests that it's maybe Reb Yehuda Leib Yafe of Kapust, who was the Madpis of Kapust, for those familiar with the history of print. And he was also the interpreter for the Alter Rebbe. So Rebbe 11 conjectures that he was probably the translator going forward as well when they had to draw up documents to submit to the government, which is what this letter is about. So it is likely, would make sense that he would be the go-to, the Chassidish translator, the one to translate and interpret and be the middleman between the Chassidim and the government. And the reason why you needed someone like that is just by way of background. We know that the Yidden at the time, of course, their main language was Yiddish, even though they had long left Germany, but that remained the lingua franca of, if that's the right term, of all Jews who identified as Ashkenaz. So they spoke Yiddish, and there certainly was some familiarity with the local Slavic languages, so Ukrainian, Belarus, but from what we see, from what we know, after originally they weren't part of the Russian Empire at all. Russia, around the time of the Alter Rebbe, Russia had captured these shtachim, these regions, and that's how the Russian government suddenly found itself with all these tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or soon to be millions of Jews on their hands, which hadn't been part of the Russian Empire before. So Russia was the invader, you could say, and the Jews did not immediately integrate and connect with their new overlords. So the average Yid, average Hamish Yid, it seems, did not really speak Russian much. So anything, whenever you had to interact with the government, especially if you entailed writing formal documents, you always had your educated Jew who, whatever it was, 1 or 2 or 3 people per kehillah that knew how to interact with the authorities, knew how to write proper Russian that would be respectable. So that's why Mitteler Rebbe in this case is writing to this individual who we're assuming might be Migdal Yafa of Kapust. And Mitteler Rebbe writes to him, please read my enclosed letter. I'm not going to read every word here. And then at some point Mitteler Rebbe starts saying, we need to think about, we need to strategize, and we need to think about these 2 tracks. Whether it's the financial route, the financial aspect, and the specific amount which this the Malshin is being mekatrig, but that's one thing. But then there's also the other thing, begam beguf inyan harabonus v'hachassidus shenoyeg b'chol ha'olam af ba'ashkenaz v'sfarad v'Yerushalayim. But there's also the aspect, the element of the Rabbanus itself and the Chassidus that's practiced, that's found in the whole world, also in Ashkenaz and Sfarad and Yerushalayim. Each one has like Yerushalayim, quotation marks for emphasis, which was the minig at the time, how to emphasize words before bold italics and underline were invented. That was the derech. So the 3 words Ashkenaz, Sfarad, and Yerushalayim are emphasized in that manner. So Mitteler Rebbe is alluding to the fact that there's 2 issues here that have to be addressed. There's the money, the maimed, which was, you could say, maybe the main part of the Malshinos, but then there's the Rabbanos and the Chassidus. So part of the Malshinos was that the whole Rebistve, the fact that Mitteler Rebbe is feeding Rebistve is problematic and running against the way things should be organized. And then there's also specifically about the Chassidus, that they're doing things differently than the average Jew. So the Mitteler Rebbe is saying that we also have to address the guf inyan harabbanos v'hachassidus shenoyeg b'chol ha'olam. So he's emphasizing something here. He's saying, and this is something that's done everywhere, Ashkenaz, Sfarad, and Yerushalayim. So that's something that is interesting and something that we need to unpack, and we're going to try to do that as we go through these sources, as we go through this material. And you could see how Rebbe 11 tries to explain it. I don't know if he fully explains or appreciates what the significance of this line is, but let's move along here. Mitteler Rebbe continues, who better than you can tell us the best way to go about making sure it's all according to the law, dotting the I's, crossing the T's. We want to make sure that in our presentation is persuasive and fully based on the law, so that there can't be any hirur chas v'shalom. There can't be no one can come back and say there's still an issue, there's still a concern. And he says, it sounds like he's saying the problem is that if you look at, seems to refer to a document issued by the governor, and the governor was sort of parroting, echoing what the Malshin told him. He says, if you look in the Niyar Shel Adain Hagadol, if you look in the governor's paper, he starts off and he says, Sheyesh mechzikei das hayeshana ve'ivrim amitiyim. There are those who keep the old religion. They're the true Hebrews, the true Jews, Yevrei. And in Russian, we know that B'chal Jews have 2 names, Ivrim and Yehudim. And if you look through different countries, you'll see some use the local version of Ivrim as the Ikr name, and some use the local version of Yehudim as the Ikr name. We know in English is Hebrews versus Jews. Today, Hebrews is not considered a nice way to refer to the Jewish people, and Jewish is preferred. In Russia, it's the opposite. Jews is not the ideal term, and Yevrei, Hebrews, is the preferred term. So Yesh Machziki Dasa Yeshana ve'Ivrim Amitim, and then there's V'chadashim Mikarev. So the Mitteler Rebbe is analyzing. He says, you see what the governor is writing. You see where what the Malshim planted in his head. So this is where they're coming from. This is what we have to counteract. We have to figure out how to get them to see things our way on this issue. Please work quickly on this. We need to move. And he says this is the Yisoid shel kol ma she'asad liyas ad rum hamaylas. Essentially, this is the future of Chassidus, going all the way up to the top, perhaps up to the top of the Russian government. It's hinging on this. So we really need to do this quick. We need to do this right. And you can also compare the previous letter there in Igris, which is also strategized. It doesn't touch on this particular point, which is why I didn't quote it. But also speaking generally about how to write things correctly and how to do it right. And there in that letter, the Mitteler Rebbe says, if we don't build a foundation for the future before this ruler, before this governor, then we don't have a place to live. Where Berlo understands, this region, at least in Vitebsk, in the region of Vitebsk where we all live, we can't live here. So that would be pretty traumatic if suddenly the whole movement was unable to live in this area. So this is very serious. Mitteler Rebbe is really laying out the stakes here of what we're up against and what we need to accomplish. Mitteler Rebbe continues, and it's like a bit of a pep talk. You have to really think about how to get it right, how to balance it, how to get the message out. I don't know if he means Mamish Baruchnius or he means here the local and the Russian Tsar as well, but it sounds like Mamish even Lamaila, based in Shemaila Fnei Adoin Kol Haaretz, and like we say, no pressure. It's just based in Shalmata, based in Shalmaila. There's no room for error. And Mitteler Rebbe continues and says, "Uschos Admo zal yamad loy lanu be'es kazois sheyakublu l'ratzon." And the schos of my father, our teacher, the Alter Rebbe, should be there to at this time that what you write, what we come up with, what you submit will have the right effect. And again, he repeats, and this is going to be the foundation for the future. That this is going to shut this down, and if we do this right, we won't have this problem again. And as far as I know, after this, I'm not aware of any serious such attempt, legal challenge against the Tunas Chassidus. So what the Mitteler Rebbe is saying here seems to be borne out. Of course, we know by the time the Tzemach Tzedek came around, there were larger issues. You could say the whole Yiddishkeit, and that's when the Tsar started chapping sich with the whole Jewish population of Russia. So in a way, things were worse. But Chassidus per se wasn't challenged in this sense, as far as I know. Afterwards, that's what Mitteler Rebbe was trying to establish, trying to achieve. And Mitteler Rebbe adds, the liknus loy chalkoi be'er olam chulu ulezaknusa bli safek itay imay b'mchitzasei. Very starke l'shaynes from Mitteler Rebbe Bechlal. If you go through Mitteler Rebbe's letters Bechlal, the ones that are in the Igris, or even the ones that are not printed in the Igris, Mitteler Rebbe always has very vivid, very strong l'shaynes that I don't think you find really with other Rebbeim. And here he's saying pretty explicitly that you're gonna be kaina chalkei be'er olam and ita imay b'mchitzasei. He's referring to Mchitzasei of the Alter Rebbe. He's promising him ita b'mchitzasei. We know there's different Chassidus Shemaises where we talk about the Rebbeim using this language. Here you have his mamash piksav. Mitteler Rebbe is writing a piksav to this individual that ita imay b'mchitzasei. In the previous letter as well, he concludes with betcheni ba'avosei v'skashrusei. Yasal es kazois uzeknus letevis when basically yomim laman bareva shanim shagil gvuris v'yaser yiske yira pnei adenenu avinu zal b'makim menuchase began eden You're going to see the Alter Rebbe in Gan Eden, and he'll be Mila you together with him. So all the Aliyahs and the Neshama of the Alter Rebbe, you're going to be there with him. There's no doubt that my father knows about our tsar, is aware of the tsar that we're undergoing right now. These are very, very special, unusual lashonos, and that alone is worth this discussion to highlight the point of these lashonos. And later I'm going to cite this letter in the Kovetz Yagdol Torah from Rabbi Shmuel Munshine, where he wrote ha'aris on these letters. And Munshine points out that on this lashon, b'lei sofek yada avuna b'yitzar didan, that debunks the shmua b'shem the Alter Rebbe. There's a shmua from the Alter Rebbe that said, the Alter Rebbe said before he passed away, you should know that the Mesim don't know anything of what's happening below here, and if they did, then a lot of things would bother them. It's not quoted here, but I believe the example the Alter Rebbe gives is of Maris Machpeil and Chevron. The Avis, how could the Avis stand what's going on up there, Makom Kvurasam? So the Alter Rebbe was sort of telling his family, say goodbye, but we're not gonna keep in touch. That's the shmua, and this is very controversial. Obviously, we know this discussion goes back to Chazal. There's a very large discussion b'chalal about the awareness of Mesim. So here in that shmua, the Alter Rebbe seems to be taking a very strong stance about that. That's it. I'm not gonna be aware. I'm not gonna keep in touch, and that's it. But yet, here we see the Mitteler Rebbe writes very clearly in the previous letter, b'li safek yada avuna b'hait tzar didan. Mitteler Rebbe was certain that the Alter Rebbe is aware of the tsar, so that's Bishul Munshine's raya against that shmua. We're not going to get into that whole discussion. I believe there's been big discussions about whether this was the Alter Rebbe shitter or wasn't the Alter Rebbe shitter. We're not going to get into it, but that was sort of Bishul Munshine's ha'ara from this lashon, that even from these small shaynas you can be chadish, interesting in yonim. That's what the Mitteler Rebbe wrote to this fellow. And he signs Divrei of Nafsha, and he adds Michtav Halaz Yiyeh Le'ed Kol Yom. This letter will be a testimony, I guess, to the previous words that I'm your Oyev Nafsha, Koisem Mikiras Lavavai. Like this, you should treasure this letter. This is a very special letter. The Mitteler Rebbe is writing with this awareness. You should keep this letter. In Taka, this letter was preserved, and that's why we're able to read it now. So this is a very, I believe, now that we've actually taken a look at it carefully, this is a pretty interesting letter. There's a lot going on here, and among other things, we saw there is this Mitteler Rebbe is addressing this question of where the Chassidic movement fits in, and we had this lashon v'gam beguf inyan harabbanos v'hachassidus shenoeg b'chol ha'olam af be'Ashkenaz u'Sfarad v'Yerushalayim. So what exactly does that mean? We're going to continue now and look and see where else Mitteler Rebbe touches on this a bit more barachava. So if you look in the next letter in Igris of the Mitteler Rebbe, it's Ageres Samach Zayin, which about 11 dates to Adar Nisan Tafkuf Pevav, and this is addressed to Yedidai Rash Beriv Beramash, and no official attempt has been made to identify who they are. But Bar Levin says it seems like the Mitteler Rebbe is writing to Chassidim in cities in the region where the government had been doing investigations, sending down people to investigate, to interview, to figure out what the actual dynamic is in these communities, what effect is Chassidus having, is it causing strife, whatever the accusations of the Malshinos were. The government was looking into it and going down in person. So it seems like Mitteler Rebbe is writing to Chassidim in these places about how they should act, how they should respond to help Mitteler Rebbe in this situation. Mitteler Rebbe begins. I want to try to be mekatzer here. We don't have endless time. Mitteler Rebbe seems to be rejecting some kind of masa matan, where I guess Bar Levin understands it to mean that maybe negotiating with the Malshinim to try to get the Malshinim to climb down from their accusations. The Mitteler Rebbe seems to be rejecting that, where it seems to be in line with what we saw before. Mitteler Rebbe wanted Dafka to follow through and win the case. If we don't win the case, then this will be an endless problem. And he mentions V'nosnu Einayim Bi Dafka, the chaplains up with me, L'Rakedes Hadoiv, to make the bear dance, alluding to his name, Dov Ber. And the Mitteler Rebbe seems to be saying we need to fight this all the way, and we need to fix this And the Masamatan approach is not going to work, because there were different ways you could deal with a problem like that. So we don't need the behind the scenes askanus, we need to fight it frontally. Then the Rebbe says, I'm already aged. I can't stand in this fight this battle the way my father did. How can I compare myself to my father? He had the chachma and he had the gvura. He was able to fight. I can't fight it the way so if you take a look at the case of the Alter Rebbe, we see the Alter Rebbe wrote, he was in jail for the duration. He wrote these very powerful responses that seemingly were the main reason why he ultimately was exonerated. So Mitteler Rebbe seems to be saying, I'm not of the same stature. I'm also concerned spiritually. It's hard to know, if it's all up to me. I guess that's still the context there. That who knows what the kitrug is? Maybe this kitrugim that Said and Orim and Said of Alabatim are not going about Chassidus, the effort in tefillah and in learning. Maybe it's not as darf to sein. So Mitteler Rebbe is saying that's a kitrug on me. So if it all comes down to me, I'm concerned about making it all rest on my shoulders. Now, what's this lashon Orim and Balabatim? So Bar Levin says, maybe the kitrug on the Orim is referring to the Kantonistan that was already on the horizon at this point. I'm not sure that has anything to do with what the Mitteler Rebbe seems to be saying. Mitteler Rebbe uses the word Na'arim. It would be interesting to take the opportunity at some point to go through all the places where Mitteler Rebbe uses this term Na'arim. The term Na'arim, the way I understand it, referred to people, young people who are in their teenage years. And back then, those in their teenage years that had at least a certain minimum of Torah in their family and some money in their family, it seems like they would all get married around this time. 14, 15 was the marriageable age for, like I said, not everybody, but those that were going to continue, off caste. They didn't immediately need to go find a job. So like I said, you need a minimum of some Torah. You have to be shaykh to learning, and you have to have a little money as well. But if you were in that bracket, so you got married around then. So then, today we know, of course, there's the Bachrim. The Bachrim are Bachrim till age 20, 22, 23, 24. You have a whole class of Bachrim. Today, the way Lubavitch or all Chassidus are organized, the Bachrim are a very important denomination. There's a big segment of Bachrim. Back then, you had Bachrim Yingalite. You had 15-year-olds who were maybe maturity-wise still Bachrim, but technically they were married. Sometimes they went to the Hoif, they became Zitzers, they would get married and then immediately leave their wife and go sit in the Rebbe Shahoif and for bring there. And we find, after the Mitteler Rebbe's writings, we find that the Na'arim, the matzav of the Na'arim was always a very central concern and focus of the Mitteler Rebbe. Is always referring to the Na'arim. And that's the chayra. The Na'arim are the ones who are still of caste, that are not Balabatim yet, versus the Balabatim. So the Mitteler Rebbe is just referring to Bechlal. The chayra is a kitrug beruchnius beikar on the Na'arim, because they're the spitz. They should certainly be doing things right. The Gama Balabatim, but also the Balabatim are also supposed to. They also have responsibilities, spiritual responsibilities, and there's a kitrug on everybody. And no one's, you see throughout the letters of Mitteler Rebbe and Igros, he's always bemoaning, always criticizing that it's never be a starf design. So Mitteler Rebbe is saying, these are the kitrugim. So because Mitteler Rebbe is saying, because I can't do what my father did, and I'm afraid, so hayat sosi emuna, my eitzah is sheyuchlal haprat beklal. Instead of it just being me fighting the machine, I should just be part of the klal. We know kabel layimas when it's the klal. So then, even if there's a kitrug on me, but if you make it the whole klal, so then the Eibishter layimas, Hashem is not going to mistreat the whole klal that way. Then he adds there's interesting addition here in parentheses, which isn't fully clear. He says, I see taka that tzchus harabim is better, miskabel lamata, kamei lamayla. So like all the keturugim right now that we see, they certainly have a shayris lamayla baruchnius, yoiser min hayachid kamoini. The language here isn't so clear, and maybe we have to try to really tease it out to see what exactly Mitteler Rebbe is saying. But maybe now he's almost saying fakert, that till now he was saying maybe the kitrug is beikar on me, and now he's saying maybe fakert, maybe adrab, it's everyone's achrayas, the kitrug is on everybody, and it's everyone's achrayas. Yoiser min hayachid kamoini. It's not just me. Similarly, for the tzaddikim in the nearby region of Volin, who are no better than me, what exactly that means, we'd have to figure out exactly what the flow of the sentence here is, but it sounds interesting. It's not just me, it's Hamayna Chassidim, but what exactly the sentence is saying still needs to be worked out. At least I need to still work it out. But this is what Mitteler is making the case here, that it's not, you can't just throw it all on me. It's not going to come down to me. It's going to come down to you. Mitteler Rebbe is telling them how it's going to work. So how's it going to work? You should take the initiative. You should take the initiative, and you should submit a bakasha gedola v'atzuma, a tremendous petition, anikeres mekiras levavim, to be clear that there's true emotion there, and it should have two major themes. Latar it's called malshinos. Well, he's going to say what the two things are, but whatever your thing is going to be, what you're going to submit is going to be latar it's called malshinos. So malshinos was against the Mitteler Rebbe. You're taking the initiative. You're responding of your own initiative to be mataritz everything in the malshinos to show the sheker compared to the emes. And I'm sure that you'll be able to do it, to figure it out, to get it done. Then he adds, but don't get too smart. Don't try to overdo it. Like kaderech hachachamim that have the shminas shebashminas, you got to also not get too wise for your own sake. So what are the two themes? What themes are you hitting in your petition? So this is what you're going to say. The drashis, part of the malshinos was that's the Mitteler Rebbe darshan. So the drashis are lahaliv ulakarev halev la'avoda ulishuv mederach hara shenitzrich l'chayil l'mhaba. We're trying to inspire Yidden to do the right thing, to not do the wrong thing, which you need for your chelik and elam haba. So that's pretty important. And the parnasa, the money ish, that's the drashis component, the drashis issue. This is all actually still part one, because he's going to say soon bahabez v'hua ikar. So part one is the drashis, what they are, and the parnasa is believe shalom, ba'emes, b'cheisha gadol. No one's forcing anybody to give money. Everyone is running and loves and is so happy to give the money to support the family. And therefore you're taking the initiative and you're asking, please, government, please don't stop us. Please don't prevent us from doing this. This is so great, so important. We love it. And Mitteler Rebbe says, this is what you have to tell them. This is what you have to convey. And then here we get to the part where he's again touching on this issue of Chassidim versus other Jews. Ba'abeis v'hua ikar. The Rebbe used to say, "V'hoid v'hu ikar, v'asheni v'hu ikar." The yisoid, lister yisoid malshinim. This is the main thing to completely undermine the whole yisoid of what the malshinim are saying. It's lahasik chasimas yedei mispalim. You should get the signatures of those who daven in the shul, because part of the malshinos was that they're fighting over a shul, whatever. Without getting into the details, to get signatures from people in the shul, whichever shul it was, from the rashim, the chashuvim, and the hamoinam, and they should all attest shahachasidim heim bedin Torah achas mamish. We all follow the same Torah, and it's all one psak, all one, the same consistent way of paskening from the Shulchan Aruch. There's no distinction at all. Even in the latest chumras, the manhagim, we're all on the same page. We intermarry, we marry each other. I guess he's saying you should get it from people who are not chassidim as well. They should agree and acknowledge and say that we're all on the same page, the whole thing is fake, that there's any split, there's any disagreement, we're all one. And we know some people hate Chassidus, right? So yeah, there's Ktsas Anoshim in the Ir Gedoyla, Shemunasam, Barav HaChassid de Vilna, they're very into Harav HaChassid from Vilna, so they have Libam Behatzneya Hesnagdos, they have secretly in their heart, they have Hesnagdos, so they see a Chassid going by, so deep down they're not happy about it. But in Kolza, even the haters, Mischatnim, the Eichlim, Gam Misak and Mulutash, they also will do a shidduch with Chassidim, and they'll also eat the Chassidish Shechita. At the time, the big Chassidish Chumrah was the knives, so that Chumrah Quran, and everyone used that Chumrah. It wasn't that it didn't remain at all. Chassidim are eating a Shechita that the others don't eat. So most Yidden are mamish on the same page with the Chassidim, and certainly marry, and even the few that have the Snagdas secretly, but they also they marry and they eat from the same shchita. Interesting, the emphasis on the marriage. We know, it seems historically at the time, yes, it seemingly was true that there were shidduchim. There's a Rai Chassidish Avart that it's almost a mitzvah for a Chassidish son to take a Misnagdish daughter, because then you're grabbing another person away from the Misnagdim. But it worked and went in both directions. We know that Bichlal, there was a lot of bleeding both ways. You had children's Chassidim who, first generation, second generation Chassidim, where their children just grew up and didn't identify as Chassidim. It was a lot more fluid at the time, and that included shidduch. Sometimes it happened because the Chassid married his son off to the Misnagad's daughter, and the Chassid, the son, was sitting by the Misnagad Afkast, and his Shver influenced him, and they grabbed one away from the Chassidim. So, not to say that there wasn't some tension or pulling, tug of war back and forth, but based on what we know, it does seem this is very representative of the Matzav at the time, that they were freely marrying each other. So Mitteler Rebbe is saying this is what you have to emphasize, and you have to get people on the ground to attest to this. The Itchem Hamada, and details of who to submit it to, and says you should emphasize that you're going to answer all the questions. Any follow-up questions should be addressed to you and not to me. It's not your any chayv shem davar. The Rav here is not at fault. He has Eksav Bakasha. He was asked to come from Krem and Shug. We know after the Alter Rebbe passed away and the Mitteler Rebbe was in Krem and Shug, he got an official invitation to come to Lubavitch and to be supported. So Mitteler Rebbe is saying you should present it as, what do you have against our Rav? He was invited and he showed up, and if you have any questions, speak to us. And anyway, Mitteler Rebbe already gave his response. Mitteler Rebbe had his interactions with the governor, and he had to answer the governor directly. So he answered whatever he has to answer. Now going forwards, it's all maybe you can draw a parallel there between something that the Rebbe said in the later years as well. The idea of, is it the Rebbe or is the Rebbe That's what the Mitteler Rebbe is telling the Chassidim at the Geula. In this case, the Geula Pratis is going to be, you're going to be the ones to take care of it, to do it. And you'll demonstrate the truth. That's more or less the thrust of this letter. So there's also this theme here where here in this one, the Mitteler Rebbe is emphasizing that we all get along, we're all on the same page, it's all the same Yiddishkeit. So also touching on this sensitive point. But now we get to a very unique passage. This to me is the highlight, you could say, of this whole discussion here. And it's a very obscure passage. It's basically been printed in one obscure place. Rebbe Levin alludes to it here in the first footnote for this letter. At the end of the first footnote, he says, "See Migdal Oiz, page Shemim Hey, where there's another passage that might be connected to this letter." Look at Migdal Oiz, which is printed by Munshine. Munshine writes that he found this additional passage in some Kisvei Yad, Behemshich, to the letter that we just discussed. Now, before we jump into it, I'll just give a very tiny, just a recap of something I mentioned in passing previously. Previously, we're talking about the Mitteler Rebbe and this idea of beauty and the beauty of women. And I mentioned that one of the places where the Alter Rebbe mentions this vart is in his beer to Kegavna on Vanpor Nehirin Ben Hiru Law. And by way of background, I spoke a little bit about Kegavna, the passage that's been added to the Siddur from the Zohar, which is very interesting, very unique. And I mentioned that it didn't come from any official channel of the Siddur Harizal. We find that it was first printed in the Siddur by the Chassidim of Brod in the Tafkuf Mems, and then it seems like the Alter Rebbe was the next one to do it. And I mentioned that you had this whole circle of Chassidim and Brod who are called Chassidim, but they're not from the same Chassidic movement. And Ba'atzam, the reason for that is that Ba'atzam, there was a concept of Chassidim going back. Chassid was someone who was more pious than the others. And that typically had something to do with following the Torahs of the Hanhagas of the Arizal, once the Arizal's teachings were spread. So you could have Chassidim, that towns had Chassidim before the Baal Shem Tov came on the scene. We find in Shifchei Baal Shem Tov, where sometimes it's very clear in the language that the Baal Shem Tov came to a town, and the Chassidim of the town were deciding whether they liked the Baal Shem Tov or not. And that's the same case here with Brod. Brod had a klois, and in the klois there were very Hebrew people, and they were known as Chassidim, but they were the Chassidim of Brod, and they were not the same Chassidic movement. There may have been some contact, may have been some interaction, some positive, some negative, but it's not the Chassidic movement that we're familiar with. As I was talking about it last time, and someone reached out to me, sent me a message afterwards, that Ba'atzam, there's I think you could say at this point, it's a kind of a famous book by academic by the name of Moshe Rosman, on the Baal Shem Tov. He pointed out to me there's actually a whole chapter in the book on this point, making this point. And when I had the chance, I looked through it and I saw Taka that pretty much saying the same thing. I don't recall reading that chapter of the book before, so I guess I reached the same conclusions independently. But Mamish laid out very nicely, making this point that Baal Shem Tov didn't arise in a vacuum, and there were Chassidim before, and then the Baal Shem Tov took this existing phenomenon of Chassidim and steered it in a particular direction, which then became known as the Chassidic movement. But that explains also the term and why this was immediately the term that was attached to this movement. That's what I mentioned all of this last time. I saw it in the book. Now I was very amazed to see that there's actually a passage from the Mitteler Rebbe. Mamish spells this out in the most the clearest, most explicit terms possible. If I didn't know it until while I wasn't aware. As long as I wasn't aware that it existed, I wouldn't have imagined that such a passage existed. But there it is. So what does the Mitteler Rebbe say? This is the passage. Mahus Shem Chassid. It's hard to know exactly where the punctuation goes here. Mahus Shem Chassid Haya Avraham David Kamuvan B'Sefer Tehillim B'Slavos Udvekas Haliki B'Tmidis V'Avshatas Agashmias Ad Shmargia L'B'Chinas Navoa B'Yichidis Gula. So the concept of Chassid, the Mitteler Rebbe says, goes back to Avraham. Avraham was a Chassid, it says in the Medrash. David was a Chassid, like we see in Tehillim. Many psukim in Tehillim, Tzom Locha Nafshi, etc. Psukim that express the state of mind of a Chassid, the connection, that special connection to Elikos, Avshatas Agashmias, until you can reach even the state of Nevuah for Yechidus Gula. So this goes all the way back to Avram, from what we know from the Medrash, and David, you could see it in Tehillim. And then it continues, V'kar Chaya B'zman HaTalmud. You had this in time of Chazal, Chassidim. Chazal uses this term, right? We know Brachas, Chassidim, Rishonim. So Mitteler Rebbe says, Kar Chaya B'zman HaTalmud, Chassidim V'Anshe Maisa. That names a number of Tanaim, Amiroim. V'asku b'mitzvahs, U'kmilas Chasadim, V'yuprushim and Yoni Olam Lagami. Here Mitteler Rebbe adds a few more components. And they were Isaac mitzvahs and Milas Chasadim, and they were Prushim from Gashmias in Gansen. As we'll see in just a bit, Mitteler Rebbe is setting us up here to say that they had all of these aspects. And then we'll see that at some point, maybe some focus on some of these aspects versus others who focus on other aspects of this. So these Chassidim, Anshe Maisa of the Zman HaTalmud, so they had the Slavos and the Dveikus, presumably, and they had the Isaac mitzvahs, Prushim. Mitteler Rebbe goes on and says, "Ach b'deiros ha'achreinim nismatu halavavos, v'nimtzu rak chassidim, v'chachamim b'chol dar v'dar." A little unclear what exactly he's saying is the status now, but it's less than it was before, and you have something in every door, but maybe not exactly what it was before. And then Mitteler Rebbe fast forwards to the recent history. This is what the Mitteler Rebbe says. It was Man Ho'ari, Haya Chassidim Gam Ashkenaz. In the time of the Arizal, there already were Chassidim in Ashkenaz. It's not like even the Ari invented Chassidus, which would be one way to say it, but it's not even the Arizal. In the time of the Arizal, there were Chassidim also in Ashkenaz. And then they divided, they split, they forked into two classes of Chassidim around the time of the Baal Shem Tov. And they are Aleph, Shekol Chassidusam Hoya, Rak Hadvekus Veslavus Espalahar. One group whose emphasis is that their Chassidus is just the Dvekus component, the Slavus, the Davin. That's their take, that's the direction they took Chassidus in. The Habez, and the second direction of Chassidus is the other things we emphasize before. Ma'aseh HaMitzvahs, Shkidus Halimud, Ba'ava Rabba, Mitzvah Nefesh, that it's the learning with a ganze Geschmack, Begam Besigufim Rabbim, Betanesim, Besakal Besoram, Uprushim, Mikol Tanugay Elam Hazeh. Those are the other Chassidim, that they went in that direction, and they emphasize those things. And then Mitteler Rebbe goes on and names them. It says, Ukamoi HaChassidim de Brod, like the Chassidim of Brod. When I saw it, I couldn't believe it. Mitteler Rebbe Mamish calls them up by name. The Chassidim of Brod, Varav HaChassid, Rebbe Yom Vilna v'Talmidov. As I mentioned, I believe last time as well, the Mulna Goyen is not known B'chayev as the Chassid. The Alter Rebbe used the term. Mitteler Rebbe used the term here. Harav HaChassid, Rebbe Yom Vilna v'Talmidov, Shenikraim Gam Hayoim Prushim. They're also known as Prushim because their emphasis in Chassidus is the Prishus. So they could be known as Chassidim and they could be known as Prushim. But they're both conveying the same idea that they're different, they're better, and they're emphasizing these aspects. And it all ends up being the same idea, the same underlying idea. It's all the same goal. It's to throw away, to strip oneself of the physicality, of the materialism, and to cleave to the Bayri Yisparach. The difference is that it's by working on Avodah Shebelev, and davening on to work on your Taivas and your Hurim. And the others do it by focusing with the Mesiras Nefesh on Torah mitzvahs. And they're all known as Chassidim. They all have the same name, the same title. Kamoi, Baladesh Chachma, Bade Keach, Chavis Halavavis, Vishalah. So Mitteler Rebbe throws out three or four different groups here. You have Reishis Chachma and Shalah. We'll see later. Really, are one group. They're Arizal-like Chassidus. Then you have the Rekeach. The Rekeach is Chassidei Ashkenaz from Zman Yishanim. You have Chavis Halavavis from Spain, also a form of Chassidus. And these are all Chassidim. We're all different variations of the same thing. We're all trying to do the same thing. Okay, so back then, today we have Darshanim, Amol, and Magidim. Before Magidim, we had Mechichim. That was a title that was used at the time. Magid that says Musar. So the Mechichim, Nechlaku bein Chasidim Shalanu, Shalahem. You have our Chasidim, and the Mechichim that go in that derech, and that's essentially we don't call them Mechichim anymore, but it's the Rebbe. The Rebbe is the Mechiach. We know the Magnum Mitzvah was called a Magid in Chernobyl as well. Even Alter Rebbe, if you Rebbe mentions it, we find that Alter Rebbe was called the Magid of the Ozna. So originally the first Rebbes were building on the existing framework of there being a Magid, a Mechiach. So you have the Mechichim of our Chassidim, you have the Mechichim of their Chassidim. Kafia now, according to the same division. And according to what you find in Sfarim, the more classical sources, what we call Chassidim, they will be emphasizing, the material they'll be working from will be Reishis Chachma, Shalah, etc., Vidal. So this is, and look at Migdal later in Migdal in page Taf Chaf Aleph, he quotes this passage again in a discussion about the history of learning Sifrei Musar and Chassidus, learning Reishis Chachma, that was mentioned a lot in the earlier Dairis. Also in Heichal Habesht, in issue number 25, there's also an article there on the difference between Chassidim and Misnagdim about which Sifrei Musar to learn. He quotes this passage. That's the only place I saw this passage being quoted, besides for originally Migdal. And also in Yagul Torah, like I mentioned earlier, Bishul Munshine, when they printed these letters of the Mitteler Rebbe for the first time, so Bishul Munshine was responding, and he connected some of these dots there between this passage that he printed in Migdal and these letters of the Mitteler Rebbe, and how they're all on this theme. But it's very obscure between the Migdal and the letter to Yagul Torah. These ideas, this information isn't really out there. So that's why I was interested and excited to lay it all out more properly, so we can enjoy and appreciate what the Mitteler Rebbe was saying and doing here. So even though Mitteler Rebbe, to some extent, we have to assume it's some form of apologetics, and it's designed to explain how Chassidim could be doing their own thing, but yet it's not something new and it's not something different, and we're all doing the same thing, and we're all on the same page. But as we know, the Rebbe said it in a different context, that even if it's under duress, but what the Rebbeim say, they stand by it. So what we find here in the Mitteler Rebbe's words is a very, very fascinating, amazing historical yesod, and I find it very amazing that Mitteler Rebbe wrote this all of his own initiative. That he wrote out this whole historical theory framework to encompass all the movements of Chassidus and to explain where the Tenuos of Chassidus fits in. And like I said, this gives us a better understanding and appreciation for ourselves for where this term Chassidim and Chassidus comes from. And it comes from this context, and that's the Pshataka and Mitteler Rebbe in that letter above. Chassidus shenoig b'chol ha'olam af ba'Ashkenaz Sfarad v'Yerushalayim. And when he said the Rabbanos, he also in the Rabbanos in this sense. The Rabbanos of someone who leads this Tenuah of Chassidus. You have it in Ashkenaz, you have it in Sfarad. So Ashkenaz could be referring to the Keach, or Sfarad could be referring to the Chivas Lavavis, and Yerushalayim could be referring to, well, not the Arizal per se, but you see these Tenuahs of different pietistic movements have always been around. That was what the Rebbe was referring to there, l'chayra bekitzer. In light of this, we could perhaps appreciate more the writings of the Frierdiker Rebbe as well. We have the famous letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's printed in Chelik Gimel, Bez Igris. It's called the Lange Briv to his daughter, the Rebbe from Chaimushka, from Shvat Tavish Tzadik Hey. And a big part of the plot is the Parush, and describing the Parush and his Prishos, and this fellow who's torn between the two paths of which path to go in. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is writing it in a very stylized fashion, the Kedarka of the Frierdiker Rebbe style. Frierdiker Rebbe is sort of creating a narrative and a tension and a drama around this theme of people at that time that sort of were faced with a choice. There was this path, but people that were looking to not live your regular average life. There were people that wanted to have a derhib in a life, to throw away the gashmas of like Mitteler Rebbe says, to cleave to the Eibishter. And there was this tension of what's the correct path, which path to take. But as the Mitteler Rebbe puts it, it's sort of we're fighting over the same people. The same people could choose either path. And perhaps this is another commonality. I already mentioned that we can find commonalities between the style of writing of the Mitteler Rebbe and the style of writing of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So maybe this is another parallel where Frierdiker Rebbe was obviously very interested in describing this history, talking about this history in his style and his approach. And here we find Mitteler Rebbe is also doing a version of that. If you look in Migdal there, where he printed this passage, it's a whole paragraph there on Chassidim, Misnagdim, different references from Toras Chabad, and you'll see he brings a whole shtickle there from the Tzemach Tzedek as well. But the Tzemach Tzedek seems to also be doing something similar with comparing, contrasting what our Magidim focus on versus their Magidim. So there's more to that. This was a topic, a theme that occupied the Chassidim and the Rebbe's, Mitteler Tzemach Tzedek, maybe the Alter Rebbe as well, at that time, trying to provide a framework to explain where everyone's coming from and how we all fit in. Also interesting, just the term the Prushim, right? That's another term that we sort of hear and it's thrown around. And you could say that the term Prushim for the Talmidei Agra that moved to Eretz Yisrael also underwent the same process that the term Chassidim underwent in the Chassidus Welt, where originally it actually had strong connotation, it had a specific social connotation, and then at some point it just becomes the label, like, oh, you belong to the Chassidim, you belong to the Prussian. At some point we know in Eretz Yisrael, those were the two big camps you had among the Ashkenazim. Either you had the Chassidim versus the Prussian. So all of a sudden it was each one had their own brand, and then the Prussian were no longer called Prussian. We're no longer called Chassidim anymore. The Chassidim completely cornered that brand, and the Prussian cornered the brand of Prussian, and then so you had the Chassidim versus the Prussian. So here Mitteler Rebbe is describing a point where the Vilna Gaon was still referred to as a Chassid as well. So this is very fascinating, and I was very happy to come across this passage, which otherwise has been mostly neglected and overlooked. And maybe here's the place to throw out my pitch, my idea. I believe that even though Migdal exists, and you have a lot of different shtiklach that are printed there and in other places as well, but in addition to reprinting or making sure that it's in print, I think there's a lot of room on the market to create a new sefer written in the style and the format of this generation that shines a spotlight on some of these unique passages that are not mamarim, they're not igris, they don't really have a particular genre, they don't have a specific place where they fit. You have from the Rebbeim, you have from the Chassidim, there's all kinds of interesting shtiklach that are a bit homeless, and would be a very nice gedank to try to put something like that together. While we're on the topic of Mitteler Rebbe, I should point out, I'll mention that there's a digital publication called Genzaya that is published every week, it seems, and the one that was just released this evening has contained some interesting letters of the Mitteler Rebbe from much earlier tkufa, from the more towards the beginning after Alter Rebbe passed away. We know that it wasn't so pashut then. Were different factions, different groups within the Talmidim of the Alter Rebbe, and Mitteler Rebbe had to sort of fight a bit to assert his place. And there are certain letters that are not printed in Igris. Bar Levin has made the decision not to include them, and this kavitz actually put together some of them. In fact, there's one letter in particular that actually was preserved via its translation in Russian in the case files of the Mitteler Rebbe's case. It has never really been translated properly before, and it sheds a lot of light on the dynamics at the time. I'm not going to get into it now, but I figure I should mention it, give it a shout out, check it out. I'll also conclude by mentioning that maybe for another opportunity, it would be interesting to discuss how, in light of this history, it would be interesting, like I said, the word Chassidim or Chassidus sort of just became a brand name, but if we were to re-examine this term and the use of the term and the meaning, connotation of the term, it would be interesting to do that in light of where the Chassidic movement is holding today, and to ask and question, what exactly does the word Chassid, obviously Chassid in Yiddish has come to mean a Chassid of, a follower of. That's not really what Chassid means, as we see. Chassid had a specific social connotation, and the question of how much is that term being used correctly based on that history and that context, which Mitteler Rebbe is very aware of, and what does that teach us, tell us, remind us about people that want to identify as Chassidim? What does that term actually mean? What does it actually demand of us to be worthy of using this term, not just in an extremely borrowed sense? But that's for another time. And that's what we're covering on this occasion, and it is very late, but I did want to actually continue now on another topic that's related to this parsha, but I'm going to pause now, and it's going to go up as a separate shtickle. So I'm going to pause, but you don't have to run away.